Hello, I'm Josh from my channel. I'm in Phuoc Ngo, Vietnam. Uh, so this is going to be probably low edit and as quick as possible, also because I'm definitely in the view of people can hear me and see me, and I feel obnoxious right now. But I wanted to get this out because we're in the middle of Nonfiction November. This is basically my nonfiction recommendation list, part 5, my 5th year book 2. And I have some nonfiction lists. This is basically a preview of my best nonfiction books of this year, with a few books coming from the end of last year. A lot of these are going to be politics, just because I've been reading a lot of politics lately because the election is sort of my mind. But before we get into politics, let me give you the few recommendations that I have that are not. First up is a book that just really surprised me and how much I found myself loving it, despite how broad-reaching it is and what it's discussing. And this is What Makes This Book So Great by Joe Walton, a collection of blog posts, really, but essays, I guess, about different sci-fi speculative fantasy books. It has just classic works of speculative fiction that she likes talking about. And there's this really personal nature of this book that really pulls you in, that is coupled with, I think, a really compelling narrative about each of these books I've almost never heard of, that she has made me want to read. If you read this book, you'll have a huge list of new books you want to read. And as someone who's been trying to read more backlist books, it was the perfect thing that I needed, honestly. I feel so obnoxious. I'm going to keep going. These people don't know me, I don't know them. Next up is another surprising nonfiction book, one that I didn't expect to like as much as I did. Being Henry by Henry Winkler. Basically, it's a book his time as the Fonz on Happy Days and just his life. And while this isn't necessarily the best biography I've ever read, it surprised me in that, as someone who was not particularly a huge fan of him, like I didn't know him as the Fonz. I know him from Adam Sandler films and from Parks and Rec, honestly. But this book was just, one, compellingly narrated, because I listened to the audiobook. It's narrated by him, obviously. And it was just he's a comedian. He knows how to write a compelling and, just engaging narrative. And that's what was here. If you want a book that is just an easy and fun read by a celebrity you might know casually, this is an easy one to pick up. If you're a fan of his, it's an easy recommend, because it's a solid book for anyone who is a fan of him and wants to learn more about his life. But overall, I'm recommending this just because I found it thoroughly enjoyable and also just a real surprise. This might have been one of my biggest surprises of last year. Next up is Roxane Gray's newest collection, Opinions. And while I loved this, I will say it's my least favorite of her collections that she's had, all of which I'm pretty sure I've recommended on past videos. And the reason I liked it less is because it's less focused. I mean, by definition, it's Opinions, a decade of arguments. So it's just a collection of essays she's written in the last decade or more, of a range of different topics. She actually just recently wrote an essay on the election that I highly recommend. It's on the New York Times, also linked on her Twitter, I think, or maybe it's from Blue Sky, where she talks about what the election we're at and misinformation and the fact that we're all adults, and at some point people need to be real responsible for the choices they make. At some point, we need to realize these people are adults, capable of making their own decisions. And at some point, they just want to believe misinformation, which is a topic I'll touch on a bit more when I get to another book, when we get to politics. Those words are getting closer to now. Next up is Read Dangerously by Azar Nafasi. She's an Iranian American. This is a collection of essays that talk about different books that have really pushed the narrative, or that pushed social norms in different countries. And I honestly really loved this. This was a nearly perfect book for me. I think my biggest critique was it was very much of its time, written in 2020, and there's a lot of things that feel just a little too present, a little too universal at the time as far as the information that's being communicated. But those aren't, I think, throughout the entirety of the book. And on top of that, but those are two criticisms that I think were small parts, but otherwise very compelling, very thought-provoking book. So this one, kind of like Joe Walton, is one that talks about books you're likely to want to read after. But more than that, I think it actually has a really thoughtful discussion of these books. Next up, we have Angela White Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle. This is one that discusses the nature of freedom in the United States, rather oppression, and how that presents itself across the world, with a particular focus on Palestinian struggle and oppression. This is a very concise book, and I think in a lot of ways it is introductory. It feels like I need to do more reading on this, but as an introduction, I think this works really well. It's very compelling in setting up or outlining how oppressive systems interconnect, how we to be free, we have to recognize the importance of freedom across the world. I read this back in February, so it's been a while. But obviously, you need to read the book to really get a good sense of it. How Democracies Die by two authors whose names I forget. And this is one that I loved. I read it before the election, and it basically just talks about the threat that Trump was during his presidency. And at that point, a lot of it was rhetoric. Things have escalated naturally. And it talked about how we go about preventing democracy from dying, how democracies die across the world. So you have the U.S. and you also have the historical context. I thought it was a really compelling book in a lot of ways. It was thought-provoking, interesting, had, I think, substantive things to say that weren't obvious, while also just being written in a very compelling way. It talked about how we approach it, how we fix it, and the importance of norms, and this idea of, do we fix these norms, fix the democracy by further eroding them, by challenging or breaking norms like the Republicans? This book, I think, makes a compelling argument about how that's just going to do more damage. But at this point, how do we fix it? I mean, beating Trump was not going to fix the democracy, but it was an important step in that direction. In the same way, though, I guess it's not a foregone conclusion that it's gone. But this book is a compelling case about why we should have been worried, and why we should still be worried. Okay, moving on to the next one. Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America by Heather Cox Richardson. This is one that I heard on the Daily Show, no, the weekly show, whatever, Jon Stewart's weekly podcast. And this is the first book that I read post-election as I try to reckon with understanding how we got here. And this one, I think, is what it connects to Roxane Gay's newest essay, making a compelling case for how and why people want to believe bullshit. How in history, authoritarians and demagogues try to separate and create enemies of others to get people to be compelled to vote for them, to get them motivated. The solution, I think, is supposed to be that we need to give more attention to people who feel a lot of attention, which isn't necessarily it's going to be, when I say should do, I'm saying we need to do it if we want them, if we want to convince them. I'm not saying they deserve it, because something like giving everyone equal rights, it doesn't take away from the rights of the straight white man. I'm not explaining this very well. It's an idea of messaging, of having to better target it to make it clear that rising tide lifts all boats, or something like that. And while everyone still stands to benefit from these progressive policies that also address intersectional minority groups, the reality is people have to have their hand held. You have to. So I'm just discussing it. The reality is, I think we do need to manipulate how we communicate these things. We have to hide the fact that we are trying to help underrepresented groups. Otherwise, it creates this otherism. And I say this because I feel like we live in this dystopia, because of course we do. I'm sorry, I'm ranting. And it's like, how do we fix it? Because in some ways, to fix it, we have to play politics in a disgusting way. And honestly, I think it might be the way to do it. But that's a bigger conversation that I would love to have as I do a bit more reading on books like this. I really hope I can make this book as compelling as it is, because I'm honestly loving this book. I've got about an hour left on the audiobook, but it is a phenomenal book that I highly recommend, especially as we try to understand what happened and why it happened, beyond just the most obvious truth of America being a sexist and racist and hateful country that refuses to unpack the internal biases that they've been taught in society, that we've been taught. Anyways, moving on. This is the last one, a few more. Nixon Land, The Rise of a President and Fractured America by Rick Perlstein. This was a very long historical book about basically Nixon's rise to power and his time in office. And originally I was reading this as a way in which we think about the election. I was really hoping Trump wouldn't win re-election, but he did. And in that way, Trump's rise to power in a lot of ways mirrors Nixon's, as does the division that is there, the hate, the willingness to break laws. The difference now, of course, is we have a country, a judiciary and a legislature that is willing to tolerate those type of breaking of laws. But this book works in two ways. One, as a historical lesson of understanding where we are today and what sort of choices were made. Particularly, I was thinking about the election of Johnson versus Nixon and how Johnson drops out. You have this massive party fight, and there was I think, a compelling argument made that part of the reason that everyone supported Kamala Harris so quickly was because that division has correlated significantly in history, not just in this point in time with Johnson, but here and other times with basically party losses. You need unity, and I think this is an example of why that might have been the right approach. Obviously, she still lost, and I'm sure you can have people who will make cases that there should have been a primary. I'm not here to have that conversation. There's no good answer. But as a historical context, this book works well. As a work of nonfiction, it works really well. I think it's an expertly written book that is very compelling, and it's not just about Nixon. Yes, Nixon is the central focus, but what makes this book work so well is that it is a historical perspective of the entire American culture, or political landscape beyond just Nixon. Nixon is the centerpiece, but we're creating an entire world around him. And in that way, this book, honestly, is phenomenal. Highly recommend for all those reasons. Okay, next up, another book that I have a standalone review for that I haven't posted. Find Me the Votes by Michael Iskoff and others. A book about Fani Willis, her case against Donald Trump. It's a compelling historical narrative that I think has stuff to say that isn't just stuff that I already heard as a Georgian, or Georgia resident at least, or Georgia voter. Where it's going to go from here, who the fuck knows? As working on fiction, again, I think it's compellingly written, and I really liked it. So far, the cases are dismissed, and all the cases Trump has, the state one is the most likely not to go away. But I'm in a pretty unoptimistic point right now, so don't ask me what I think is going to happen there. And then I have one more book to even this out at 10. This is the one that I probably liked least in this list, but still a solid book that I think is thought-provoking, but critiques that I'll get to. It's Autocracy Incorporated by Anne Applebaum. This talks about the nature of autocracies, how they rise, and the same way these other books works. It worked as a good warning against Donald Trump, a warning we didn't listen to. My problem with this book is that while it makes a compelling case and an interesting analysis of history, it is extremely focused on modern day conflicts in a way that I feel like is very tunnel vision, very short-sighted, and I think it could have been crafted a bit more expertly to better weave throughout history, to tell a story in a way that I think will stand test of time, in a way that I don't think this one will. But that is it. These were the 10 books I recommend, nonfiction books, this year for Nonfiction November. Of course, you can read them at any time. I know a lot of them are election focused, but if you watched, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this atmospheric video, and I hope the sound's not too bad. But as always, have a great day, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.